Well, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this. It's kind of a special edition of the quarterly Menopause at Work network meeting. And today it's being delivered in collaboration with Sue Chennell. Hi, Sue, founder of Shared Safety and Risk, and also David Savio, who's going to bring a lot of practical experience to this topic. So I can see some familiar names online today, which is awesome. But for those of you who I haven't met, my name's Thea. I'm the founder and director of Menopause at Work Asia Pacific, and I've been bringing menopause literacy to workplaces since 2019. And these events are designed for workplace professionals like yourself to come together, to connect, to learn, and to share what does it really practically mean to embed menopause awareness and support in workplaces. Now, I'm really interested to know what experience we already have on the line today. So I'm just going to post this quiz here. And I'm just interested to know, in your organization, have you introduced any education, training, perhaps some resources? Have you actually educated any work health and safety practitioners, perhaps introduced leave, or perhaps you don't actually know? And just while you're answering that, I'll just run through a few logistics. As you're aware, today's session is recorded, so please manage your cameras as you feel. Although when it comes to Q&A, we really do love to see live faces and voices, so don't be shy. The main content of today will be complete by 1 o'clock, and that will allow a good 15 minutes for Q&A. But at 1 p.m, what we do is turn off the recording and just allow another 10 minutes for informal chat. So feel very free to join us for that if you would like to. So I'm just going to check the poll now. Got about 70% voted. If anyone has just joined us, there is a poll on the screen. Would love for you to answer that, but we might just have to go. Thank you. Got a few more there. Awesome. I'm just going to end the poll and share that with you so you can see as well. So let's have a look. About 20% not currently doing anything. Half of you have got resources. Nearly a half done staff education, a quarter manager training, which is great. And a couple have done education for work health and safety practitioners. I wonder how many of those are Lifeblood, but if it's someone else, would really hear your experience when it comes to comments and Q&A. 20% got policy. Quite a few allow workplace accommodations and adjustments for menopause, about a third additional leave. Okay, and one person doesn't know. So that could be a great question to ask just when you have completed this session today. Okay, so look, I'm actually going to hand over to Sue to help introduce this topic today and create a bit of context. So Sue actually started out as a sports physio, and it was actually then her sore thumbs that developed out of that triggered her interest in injury prevention and also ergonomics. And she quickly saw that, the workplace can actually be a bit like the sporting field when it comes to, safety and risk management. And so today she draws on over 20 years experience and uses a multidisciplinary approach to create healthy and safe workplaces. And she addresses a whole range of spectrums of needs with her clients, mentors younger work health and safety professionals, which is awesome, and also does some research into evidence-based workplace health and safety intervention models. So Sue, over to you to kick us off for today.
Thanks, Thea. Great introduction and welcome everybody. Really interesting and very diverse mix of people in this session today, from sort of health and safety practitioners to wellbeing, diversity, inclusion, people leaders and HSRs, which is fantastic. So today we're really going to look at work health and safety risk through a gendered and life stage lens specific to the perimenopausal and menopausal worker. So really excited to share this discussion with Thea O'Connor, who's a workplace wellness expert. She gave expert evidence to the Federal Senate inquiry into menopause last year, was on the National Working Group for the development of an ISO standard around menopause and menstruation in the workplace. So really is a key expert sort of in this space. And then really interested and really excited to talk to David from Lifeblood around the practical sort of controls and journey that they've been on around in this space. So I guess, we can start with sort of why is this life stage starting to gain some sort of traction in the workplace discussion. Interestingly, from a health and safety perspective, there's starting to become very, very, I guess, small discussion around this topic in our sort of world. Interestingly enough, when I posted about this session on LinkedIn, I think initially I used the terminology around menopause and got very, very little engagement. Changed that slightly to talk about this life stage from a biopsychosocial risk perspective, and quite a different sort of response. So it's interesting, again, the maturity levels out there sort of talking about this and thinking about this life stage, certainly from a health and safety perspective. Pretty much in all jurisdictions in Australia, and Victoria coming online pretty soon, employers not only have an obligation to have a workplace free from discrimination, there are also key legal obligations under health and safety laws for employers to eliminate, and if they can't reasonably do that, minimise both physical and psychosocial risks to all workers. For those that aren't really clear on what psychosocial risks are, well, what they mean, that really means workplace factors that can negatively impact a worker's psychological health or physical well-being. And they're things like, poor job design, low job control, poor role clarity, sort of lack of workplace or leader supports, down to things like sort of bullying, sexual harassment. So psychosocial risks and their controls are less about sort of worker-led issues and interventions, say things like, employee assistance programs or resilience style initiatives, but they're more about the design and nature of work and the work environment. So we need to look at it from an organisational lens when we try and identify psychosocial risk factors. The regulations also want, when we're identifying some of these risk factors, is to take a hierarchical approach to managing that risk. What does that mean? That kind of means looking again at work design, the nature of work, how people work, what they do, how we do it, and in what environment they're doing it, rather than just looking at things like training or initiatives that perhaps are targeted sort of directly at the worker. So it's really about looking at an organisation as a whole. But there are a lot of protective factors sort of already in workplaces that help control some of these psychosocial risk factors. And one of the key ones is actually having a psychologically safe workplace. So that's a different term than psychosocial risk. Sometimes they get a bit interchanged, but they are very much two different things. So psychologically safe environments are environments where workers feel safe to express themselves, to raise issues, to talk about things, admit mistakes without any fear of sort of retribution. They tend to be sort of high trust environments where there's open communication, lots of innovation and collaboration. And so psychological safety, or a psychologically safe environment, is very much a protective factor for psychosocial risk. And it's important that we kind of delineate those two things, because we will talk about them a bit further down the line when we talk about how to try and manage some risks of this in this cohort of workers. So it's really important, giving this focus now from the regulators on managing psychosocial and physical workplace risks, that we enable that sort of psychologically safe environment for people to raise issues. And then if we're looking at employers trying to support all workers and to manage risks to all workers at all stages of their life while they're in your employment, we really need to enable a safe, healthy and productive working environment. So today we're going to take this sort of life stage lens, look at this menopausal worker, to identify practices and environments that can assist and control workplace risks to the menopausal worker. So we're going to explore these themes with myself. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the physical risks. Thea will talk a little bit about some of the psychosocial risks and controls and workplace adjustments that we can have in the workplace. And Dave is going to share Lifeblood's journey around managing this life stage risk. We're hoping at the end of today that you can take sort of 3 or 4 key kind of takeaways with you back either into your own life or particularly into your work and into your workplace. So when we think about menopause, most people who menstruate are going to transition to menopause and might experience really emphasis on the may, experience perimenopausal symptoms between the ages of somewhere between sort of 45 and 60. And for anyone that's sort of in that life stage, we know that those symptoms can be pretty broad. The age range is pretty broad as well. When I was a physio, I had a kind of keen interest in those signs and symptoms that women of a certain age presented to me in the clinic. Certainly continued when I worked for a workers' comp insurer, and I would see, again, claims and injuries to do with a certain age of worker. And then I was also a rehab provider for a little while too, and really saw, again, this kind of, I guess, repetitive sort of nature of some of the disorders that we were seeing in women of a certain age. And then now in the sort of the health and safety space, the effects, I think, of this life stage on the risk to female workers in the workplace is rarely sort of discussed. We're only really starting to see a little bit of a discussion around it now. So, this is where we want to start this conversation, start to have this broader look at the life stage lens of workplace risk. Estrogen, it's kind of the key hormone in this whole thing, and it has a really potent anti-inflammatory effect. So if there's a decline in the key sort of biologically active form of estrogen, which is called estradiol, if that goes down, it really much can, again, not necessarily say it will, but it can impact nearly all types of musculoskeletal tissue: bone, tendon, muscle, cartilage, ligaments, and even adipose and fatty tissue. So the types of symptoms that people might get from a musculoskeletal perspective are pretty broad, to anything from general musculoskeletal pain, arthralgia, so arthritic type pains, loss of lean muscle mass. We get a loss of bone density with increased risk of fracture as we move through this stage, increased tendon and ligament injury, and that's what we see a lot of, I guess, in this space from a workers' comp claim perspective. Frozen shoulder, so adhesive capsulitis type problems. And often in this cohort, when you go and do imaging, whether it's an MRI, CT scan, X-ray, you're not going to see too much because nothing really structurally often is wrong. It is this lower, the lack of that protective nature of estrogen leading to some of these signs and symptoms. Obviously, there's a real interconnection with psychological symptoms as well, and Thea will talk to that a little bit. But when you have pain, that also increases, anxiety and mood swings and brain fog and all the irritability and other things that are known as sort of signs and symptoms from a psychological perspective in this cohort. Poor sleep, but then poor sleep can also affect your pain. And a lot of the things are very much interconnecting around and in this space. There's some kind of sobering stats around this cohort as well. And these are the stats that we know of. We don't really have specific workers' comp data that we can really extract sort of from a national perspective to look at trends. But the insurer AXA analysed more than 10 years of their disability claims. They're a life insurance insurer. And over that 10 years of disability claims, they showed a real significant change in the prevalence of mental health conditions and musculoskeletal conditions for women between the ages of 40 and 55 compared to those of a younger age. And particularly, there was a real higher prevalence of soft tissue related and musculoskeletal soft tissue sort of disorders. HESTA, the super fund for health and community services, some of you may be members of HESTA, they surveyed, they've actually got a membership base, it's about 80% women. They recently surveyed their members. But 58% of female responders attributed menopause and menopause-like symptoms to their inability to concentrate at work, forcing them to reduce their work hours, take sick leave, or in some cases retire early. Along the same sort of vein, the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees. So again, these are people looking at, from their membership, surveyed almost 30% of women that responded to their survey said that they left the workplace early before reaching the age of 55 due to menopause and perimenopausal symptoms. So we can see, the physical nature of some of these risks and then what it can lead to. So, from a health and safety perspective, we really need to try and create an environment that manages psychosocial and physical risks to this cohort. And it's not just a benefit to organisations in retaining sort of that experience and that knowledge, but obviously it makes a broader economic sense to our community. So Thea, I'm going to sort of ask you a couple of questions around this. I've talked a bit about physical and musculoskeletal impacts for this cohort that might affect them in the workplace. But what are some of the psychosocial risks that, I guess, and impacts you've seen in workplaces? And what have you seen workplaces start to do to manage those?
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing in your physio experience there, Sue. So it's been interesting, hasn't it? Over the last few years, there's been a lot more attention on managing the psychosocial risks. And while I'm not a safety practitioner myself, I have been staring at that list, even of the most common ones. And I've been looking at that and thinking, this is relevant to menopause. So some standout ones for me are around lack of support. And all the surveys that I've read to date will say that generally, no, women aren't happy with the level of support in their organisation, or they don't feel like they could talk to their manager. That's changing, but I'd say by far the vast majority of workplaces wouldn't rate well on that one. So there's a risk already. There's also things like, discrimination, menopause-related discrimination, whether it was on the basis of, say, age or gender or disability. That's actually illegal. But I continually hear stories of what you might call low-level harassment. So, for example, when I have people join some of my programs, they said, oh, look, I just told my colleagues I was going to the menopause program, and they'll often report, people cracking jokes or eye rolling. So there's this kind of subtle, I would call it a form of harassment that we wouldn't tolerate for any other life stage or condition. So I think we have a high level of tolerance of making fun of midlife women. And I think we really need to kind of wise up to that. Because what we are seeing in the UK is an increase in menopause-related workplace tribunals. So it actually tripled. I jotted down some stats here. Yeah, so in 2022, there were 64 cases related to menopause. And then just last year, that rose to over 200. So workplaces do need to know that this is an organisational risk that needs to be managed, as well as important for taking care of individuals. And it's interesting because if you dive into some of those cases, some of those tribunal cases, often what happened is just the manager did and said dumb things because they didn't have a clue. They hadn't been educated. So yeah, those two, the discrimination and lack of support, and perhaps also lack of, career development opportunities stand out for me. And then I guess the other thing that can happen is some of the impacts of menopause itself could create a workplace risk. So, for example, fatigue is often one of the number one knock-on impacts that women will say most negatively affects work. That could be due to hormonal changes or the knock-on effect of things like anxiety or not being able to sleep. And when I look at or ask about workplace policies that are, fatigue management policies, first of all, they generally don't include a mention of menopause. And if they do have fatigue management policies, it still tends to be for outdoor workers more so than office workers. And we forget that things like errors of judgment or decision making, they're real risks that could result from things like, say, fatigue, maybe from some of the brain fog experiences that women can have, and also maybe due to the increased risk of mental health issues during the menopause transition. But they're most risky, of course, as you would know, when they're unnamed and we feel like we can't talk about it and therefore don't actually make the simple adjustments that could actually, just take the edge off at least. Yeah. So I think it is something that it needs to get on the work health and safety agenda. So it's great to have somebody here today talking about that. Yeah. And then I guess, go on.
Oh, Thea, what have you started to see around those that are starting to manage this?
Yes.
What are you starting to see in slightly more mature organisations?
Yeah, the most common thing I'm seeing is people starting to recognise, that list of accommodations that they've already got, perhaps for other things, they can easily be adapted or built out for menopause. And so that's great. Flexible work is often a number one thing. Could just be the desk fan for temperature control. Could be some headphones if you're having trouble concentrating. So that's what I'm starting to see people do. But the best adjustments are those that are really, really tailored to the job, the person, and the role. And that's why I've been so impressed with what Lifeblood has been doing, because they've actually taken a real deep dive into this over the last few years. And so in terms of that, practically what a workplace is doing, I'd love to kind of hand over a bit to David now. And he can talk more about what they've been doing. So, welcome, David. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Just for those who don't know you, so David is the current Director of Health, Safety and Wellbeing at Lifeblood. And his background, he's got over 20 years experience in a range of leadership and health and safety roles, spanning a whole range of different industries, from oil and gas through to disability and rehabilitation. In his current role in Lifeblood, they've been developing a Support the Pause project, for want of a better word, and it's been a real delight to have been involved in that in some ways, in terms of when you're developing up your roadmap and more recently training your managers. And also Lifeblood has recently been accredited as menopause friendly because of all the great work that they've been doing. So David, we'd love to hear a little bit more. First of all, how did menopause even get on your radar at Lifeblood? Like, how did it start? How did the whole journey start?
Yeah, well, thank you. Just to provide those online just a bit of a context around Lifeblood. So Lifeblood has approximately 4,000 employees, and they're supported also by about 1,500 volunteers. And we're a national organisation, and we have static and mobile donor centres, about 97 of those, and we also have processing centres. So we have 4 major processing centres. So across our workforce, we actually have 75% of our workforce are women, and the average age of our workforce is around about 45 years of age. So that's just to give you some context. So what we've noticed is that I'd started with Lifeblood back in 2019, and a focus at the time was around LTIs, and we were sitting at around about 9 per million hours worked, and that was just a bit of a focal point for our board and executive. And what we'd noticed is something quite interesting about the injury profile of our LTIs, and that we, as a team, we took a bit of a deep dive to understand what was at play within that, and we found some interesting things, that 83% of our incidents involving lost time also involve work-related musculoskeletal disorders. So as Sue mentioned, we very quickly identified that there was a significant commonality with those. And when we look at our workforce profile, that made us lean in with a bit more curiosity around what was happening in terms of possibly changes in endocrine system and those sorts of things. But we also found 65% of incidents that involve lost time actually involve gradual onset injury. So they weren't the sort of lost time injuries that involved a frank incident, like a shelf falling and crushing someone, for example. These were gradual onset, so they were unspecified mechanisms of injury, often involved with a combination of work tasks. We also found that 90% of our incidents involving lost time also had identified psychosocial hazards associated. And so we thought all that was quite interesting because it didn't point us to a single problem per se. What it helped us understand is a bit about the complexity of the injury profile we see in our workplace. We also noticed that 30% of those cases involve women within the peri and menopause age. Our injury support team would often be, as you'd imagine, with the lost time injury, the focus is around supporting a person with their recovery at work. And our injury support team noticed a few other themes that were at play, and that is that we found that in the conversations we're having and supporting those employees return back to work is we would find themes like domestic and family violence in some cases. We'd also find an overlay of mental disorders such as depression, anxiety, Sleep disturbances were a theme, and fatigue. There was fear avoidance behaviour. There was also an interesting interface around performance and performance deterioration. So we were finding that we were having our team were having conversations with our business partners of people and culture and ER team. And what was interesting also is we found that workplace relationships and the relationships between the injured worker and the line manager, there were some really interesting dynamics that were present in that case as well. So as Sue mentioned, for us, it became evidently clear to us that psychosocial factors, this is back in 2019, that psychosocial factors is something that we had to try to better understand. So as an organisation, we made a commitment. So we made a commitment to have a really concerted, preventative and proactive focus on psychosocial hazard management. And we, in 2019, we updated our health, safety and wellbeing policy to actually reflect that commitment. And since then, we've had a very considered focus around how we use psychosocial risk assessments. There weren't many tools available at the time. Back then, I know Dr. Jodie Oakman had been looking at the Affirm toolkit. We liked that particular toolkit because the Affirm toolkit looked at musculoskeletal sort of disorders and pain, and also the range of psychosocial factors. And we used that tool. We also used a bespoke tool. So we engaged with Monash University to try and develop, this is before codes of practice of psychosocial hazard management come out. We were looking at bespoke tools. So from there, between now, we had a very considered focus around understanding psychosocial factors. We used the simplified composite model of workplace musculoskeletal disorders, which is a tool proposed by Dr. Jodie Oakman and Wendy McDonald. And that tool essentially looks at individual factors, workplace factors, and the effects between the two, and what impact that has on things like musculoskeletal disorders and other resultant personal and workplace factors. So for us, Thea, we interrogated the data that we were seeing within our workplace. We didn't come in with a lens of, okay, this is a particular health topic that we wanted to destigmatise. I would say, though, back in 2019, we had a very considered focus around, organisationally, around how we better understand psychological health and safety and psychological safety. So we were really intentional around looking at what are our systems of work across our organisation that can help provide a workplace that's focused on psychological health and safety, as well as being able to, look at trust, look at workplace relationships, etc. So for us, it's been a considered focus. If I take where we sort of where that journey has taken us till now, back in 2024, which is not long ago, back in 2024, we decided to really better understand the topic of perimenopause, menopause. And at the time, we commissioned a survey, which was an opt-in survey. And that was, for us, it was really exciting that in an organisation of 4,000, we received 515 respondents to that survey. Mm-hmm. And we found that in that survey, it provided us a rich level of information that helped substantiate for us some of the areas that we were seeing through the injured worker space, so where we would be supporting injured workers, where we were starting to hear about these sorts of themes around the symptoms of fatigue, the symptoms around having the brain fog, but also the challenges around managing workplace relationships, for example. So for us, we found that not only was this having an impact on the individual and their health, but we also found qualitatively that there were women that were shying away from job promotions. And so there was another theme that started to emerge through this, and that was through things like a lack of self-confidence, perhaps a feeling around low workplace support. And all of these, again, are psychosocial factors that we had to consider more deeply around the design of work. So we partnered very tightly with our DE&I strategy to then look at things like equity within the workplace and inclusion. So for us, not long after we commissioned the survey, we set up a menopause working group or reference group, and that was an opt-in. We had a significant number of representatives from across our organisation, and we engaged with them. We engaged with Thea O'Connor, and with all of that focus, we come up with a Support the Pause roadmap, which is what Thea just referenced. And that Support the Pause roadmap was eventually signed off by our executive and board, and we have an executive sponsor. And since that time, we've been rolling that out. So Thea, I can talk a little bit more to sort of where that's and what that's sort of generated. But for us, what I was really proud about is that as an organisation, we were focused on the mitigation and our level of support, genuine care and support for the people that were experiencing injury and illness. And then that focus to a real methodical lens around prevention and what are the sort of underlying secondary causation factors that are in our control as an employer that we could be better understanding and then shifting the dial on to then help support people with their recovery at work. What I would note also is that our team, I'm incredibly proud of our team within the health, safety, and wellbeing team. In terms of our focus around supporting our people, we then embrace non-work related injuries as a team. So we've started to have a real considered focus around a whole person approach to health. So when we look at recovery, essentially in the workplace, we're not just looking at a workplace from a workplace lens. We're looking at from a psychosocial perspective.
Yeah, awesome. So what really struck me, when I asked how did it get on your radar, is you talked about noticing, and so you actually started looking at what was going on, perhaps with a little bit more detail. So that really stood out for me. But then you had a bit of a hypothesis. Yeah, it's like, could these gradual onset conditions be related to menopause? And what I love also is, but then you didn't make assumptions, but you went on and gathered some more data to kind of build out that hypothesis. And that's an important part of this. It's not automatically blaming everything on menopause. So you needed that little bit more evidence. So yeah, really impressed with the rigorous approach that you took there. So then what was the next step in terms of, when thinking about your actual risk assessments and then putting some controls in place with this awareness that, hey, menopause seems to be interacting with some of these incidents? How did you take that next step? Or, where are you at with that?
Yeah, I mean, look, these things aren't as linear as what you'd imagine or you'd like them to be. There were a few things that were running in parallel. So I was very interested in understanding our systems of work organisationally. So back in 2019, when we changed our policy position organisationally, we also made sure we were able to influence psychosocial hazards into our enterprise risk register. So we made sure that any conversation we were having with our exec and our board in terms of health, safety and wellbeing really ensured a checking around our systems of work in relation to psychosocial hazard management. We also, I guess in parallel to the roadmap, engage with external providers to help us with gap analysis around things like our obligation against the health, safety and work health and safety regulations for things like psychosocial hazards and risks, for example. So we wanted to pressure test our systems of work and understand where we had opportunities to actually strengthen areas in that regard. We also looked at things like the positive duty obligations. So we did a gap analysis that looked at that because, again, there were themes that we were seeing from our supporting of injured workers that, there might be elements of microaggression, for example, happening within the workplace. And so we wanted to make sure our systems of work were looking for, the sort of conduct that we didn't want in the workplace. So the positive duty obligations was another area that we focused on. And of course, our internal audits, we sort of redesigned them somewhat so they didn't just focus on the physical environment itself. So our internal work health and safety team were looking at things like understanding a little bit more around when we do incident investigations, how broad are we looking at it, and how in depth are we looking at those particular incidents to ensure they're capturing psychosocial factors. I must say, Thea, the more I sort of then turn my mind to this, the more I start to see the complexity as well, because as we heighten our focus and awareness, and in some respects, the destigmatization of perimenopause and menopause in the workplace, and that heavy interface with mental health, with, destigmatization of things like suicide and mental disorders as well. So there's just this heavy interface. We also partnered with external providers to help us understand our governance framework as well in terms of supporting mental health. So we have a governance framework that we're working on, and as well as a charter. So I guess what's happened in practical terms there is that with the roadmap, it includes lots of different things. But one of the things we wanted to do is create a Support the Pause champion network. So we started to harness the lived experience from people across our organisation and feed that into the maturing of our systems of work. So we started off with 81. This is back a little while now, but we started off with 81 Support the Pause champions. We've now got 79, which is still exciting. So we've held a steady number. The Support the Pause champions, it's an opt-in volunteered role. And with that, we provided them with training. We also, through yourself there, made training available to our leaders, and we opened up a cohort of 50 places and we filled them up. So we had 100% capacity filled there. So we sort of noticed something interesting is that as we started to generate conversation around this topic and considered focus and attention and commitment, it was reciprocated with an engagement from across our organisation. So from people from across different levels of management, we have within that 79, we have 10% of those are male. So we've got men representing in that group. We also had representatives from across our organisation attend the training. So we started to do these sort of more practical things around supporting, but then again, in those forums, we started to hear some challenges emerge around, okay, so if we're going to be providing support to our people, we found that line managers were not feeling equipped to be able to have the necessary conversations or requisite of sort of control options or levers that they could pull and push to help support someone experiencing that stage of life, for example. So we then started to focus on developing some internal resourcing around that. So we developed a guide for line managers that looks at things like language and so forth. But we also looked at developing a guide around workplace accommodations and enabling them to better consider how they might want to be able to create a flexible work arrangement, for example. So we found that some of those have been really practical tools. When we have conversations with people, we start to discover some interesting things. For example, part of the work that we do at Lifeblood is we have team members that do phlebotomy, which is putting a needle in, needle out. They wear gloves. And we found that there'd be people experiencing peri or menopause that would be having difficulty with the gloves and just finding that an uncomfortable aspect of the work in terms of the, how they put the gloves on and the precision of work. When they're working, eyewear is an important part of the control that we have in the workplace. And so we would have people talk about the gloves, the eyewear would be fogging. And so we had to think then deeply as well in terms of practical supports. Menstruation and cycles and those sorts of things, and heavy bleeding were other areas that we had to look at. So we looked at free sanitary stations across all our centres. So I guess what I'm saying is, starting back at where we did in 2019, where we identified injured workers and some commonality around musculoskeletal disorders, has now, the further we look into what we're seeing and trying to better understand that the data and what the data might be telling us has really helped foster a curiosity around a whole breadth of areas that we didn't quite anticipate way back then. So Thea, what I'd say is that that's been an interesting journey for us, to say the least, and we're very proud that as an organisation we've been accredited as an employer friendly. Truth be told, I mean, that journey, that concerted focus from the roadmap till now has really only been about 18 months. So what I would say, we've been really proud that with the considered focus, we've been able to, achieve something quite remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. It really just strikes me now what a organizational, holistic approach you have taken, which I know is your intent, but, it's great to see that you're delivering on that. When you're talking about the manager training and champion training, is that that's the way, that is part of managing the psychosocial risks, isn't it? Because that's what helps people feel safe speaking up. And that's part of it, isn't it? It's part of changing the culture. I remember in one of your manager training sessions, there was one, she was quite a senior leader. She just said, "Oh, you had a brain foggy day the other day." And I just went, "Support the pause." And she said she felt such enormous sense of relief that she could call it out. It wasn't an indictment on her competency. It was just being able to say that. And to her, it seemed like it was just transformative, just being able to name it. So well done on that piece of work as well. Just as we start wrapping up, have you got a couple of maybe other really just practical examples of those little specific adjustments you might have made? And then also just, anything about staff response, have they responded to this?
Yeah, I mean, from a practical perspective, for example, the availability of fans in the workplace. So as an organisation, we utilise existing procurement processes to ensure the availability of USB fans were made. We're in the process at the moment reviewing operational uniforms, so things like the lab coats, to ensure they can be more breathable, for example. I mentioned the free sanitary products at each of our centres has been really quite a powerful symbol for our employees. There's a whole range of areas that we're looking at practically around leave and things like 6 weeks paid leave for gender affirmation leave. So this area of sort of understanding the heavy interface with DE&I and making sure we complement our focus and intention to look as broad as we possibly can. So even more recently, endometriosis a focus on endometriosis has become quite heightened in our organisation. So we're sort of looking at the broad spectrum. So for us, the practical initiatives that we've done have often cascaded our thinking to other areas. So just the more we understand around our employee experience and what we can be doing in our organisation to sort of support in the design of that, we can then sort of work towards the solutions. But some of the solutions have been quite simple at a local level. We've empowered the line manager empowered to help support accommodations of flexible work arrangements and those sorts of things. So the leader guide, for example, provides a whole host of some of those more practical local initiatives. Our focus has been on looking at organisational, system-wide type factors that we can also influence.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for those practical examples. And thank you, Jane, for, keep them coming. Some of the other examples of what can emerge out of conversations. And like for me, I guess that's the big thing. The starting point is you have to be able to talk about this in order to be able to generate those simple, practical, and often inexpensive accommodations that can really make a difference. So thank you so much, David, for that. And congrats to the whole Lifeblood team. I think you're doing an amazing job there, and demonstrating, how you can go about this in a very holistic manner. We've got, about 10 minutes now for Q&A. And so please either pop your hand up if you've got a question, but also, Sue, please feel free to chime in as another work health and safety, professional, if you've got any observations or further questions.
Yeah, amazing journey that Lifeblood's been on. I think my two key takeaways, certainly from a health and safety perspective, is data and really being informed by data, really understanding the demographics, and I think we call it psychographics of your workforce. Like, who are they? How old are they? What's going on for them? I think, what I see with a lot of organisations is they're not really there yet with their data. And to start on this journey, we've really got to look into either the information you already have or what are some other information sources that you can get to be a bit more informed. And the other key takeaway I really got from you, David, really was around that holistic approach of really bringing psychosocial risk just into your audit tools, into your sort of if you're going to do an audit, a physical audit, psychosocial needs to be in there too. And I think anyone that's interacting with health and safety at the moment, either wellbeing, HR, health and safety practitioners, we really need to be integrating it into everything we do around this space. That's what the regulators want, but it's also, good business makes sense as well to not keep it out on the side, but actually integrate it into what we're already doing. It needs a little bit of uplift, I think, in capability, but I think it's great that you've started to do that. And I think I'm starting to see that happening a little bit more out there in practice as well.
Yeah, would anyone, like to make use of David and Sue in particular with any questions or comments? I'm also curious, I think there was one other person who did tick yes, we've, educated our work health and safety practitioners. If you're from another organisation and happy to share what you've done, would love to hear about that as well. But you can even...
And questions for Thea, of course, as well.
Course. Yeah. Thank you. What I'll also do is I'm just dropping in the chat box now just to... examples of where this is being named, and so you might have a few more. So the UK, are quite advanced in this field. One of their unions put together quite a comprehensive kit for their union reps, but at the back of it, they've actually got an example of how you would integrate menopause into your risk assessments. So you might find that helpful. And then there was just a short article by the Australian unions. Sometimes it helps to refer to other bodies if you're wanting to raise this, in your workplace and say, hey, look, here are some examples of this being named. Thanks, Andrea. So what's your advice for surfacing this focus from a work health and safety perspective while managing stigma for women? I've got a little bit to say about that, but I'll go to David first.
Can you just repeat the question? What was that?
Yeah, sure. It was just like, what's your advice for surfacing this focus from a work health and safety perspective while managing stigma for women? And that, thank you for asking that, Andrea, because in all the work I do, that's the number one concern.
Yeah, I mean, I have a philosophical view around the profession in terms of the health and safety professional, and I'm pleased to see that the reference to health is becoming more and more of a focus, and I think our assumptions around what we mean by health in terms of health and safety is quite narrow, when in fact I think we can possibly, there's an opportunity for us to really expand what we mean by health in that context. I think the challenging part around stigma is around an organisational maturity and culture around where we're at in the discussion and topic of health. And for us, we've really embraced the non-work related aspects into how we support our people. So from a health, safety and wellbeing perspective, we work really closely as a PNC unit. Work health and safety is part of our PNC team. So for us, anything we talk about or focus in terms of DE&I, employee relations, talent acquisition, health, safety, and wellbeing forms a part of that conversation and part of that thinking. The stigmatization is a really interesting one. We, as an organisation, we have had a heavy focus around destigmatizing mental illness and mental disorders, and just really trying to understand that. And I think for us, that was one of our early points of focus, and that's then helped translate to topics like peri and menopause, where there are interfaces with psychological health and emotional health. So yeah, for us, it's been a considered focus around health and having a more preventative, proactive focus on that within P&C. Yeah.
Yeah, and Andrea, I've been pondering this one for years now, and I guess where I've come to is, and particularly from a work health and safety perspective, acknowledge that stigmatization is a form of discrimination. So as a work health and safety professional, you need to know about this. So I've now actually developed a module on menopause stigma, because there has been research into it. And what it sounds like or looks like is that the stigma says that menopausal women are less likable. And yes, because we stop people pleasing. It could be that. And secondly, that we're less competent. So say, yeah, it exists. It's real. So shine a light on it rather than scurry around in the background and, don't speak up about it. So shining a light on it really helps to dismantle it. And you need to know about this as a work health and safety practitioner. In all the work that I do, I am very deliberate in highlighting the strengths of postmenopausal women, because I think menopause has been misrepresented as a scary list of symptoms rather than a developmental life stage that can take you more into your authority than ever before and be an incredible asset to the organisation. And also what can help, perhaps when you're first introducing it, sometimes the female workers themselves can fear that they're going to be stigmatized. And they will often say, I always get a small percentage in my surveys who say, most people say, yep, bring on the menopause at work thing. Small percentage are worried that this is going to reinforce the stigma. And they say, well, why aren't we focusing on men's testosterone-fueled behavior? So, another approach could be, don't just do menopause. Do say that we're doing a gendered health thing at the moment, and do some stuff around men's health as well, so it doesn't just feel like it's women. Because as men get older, they need to get up in the night and go to the toilet. They start forgetting things. Their muscle mass goes down, etc., etc. So placing it in that bigger context. But I think the bottom line is, you don't want to let the fear prevent you from addressing this, because the fear silences. And when women work uneducated and unsupported, that's what's going to reinforce any gendered ageism, attitudes, because you will be seen as less competent unless we can say, this is what it's about. It's temporary and we just need some adjustments. So that's my rave on it, Andrea.
Very well explained. That's great.
So have a think as to whether you've got some more questions, but we wanted you to go with some practical takeaways today, didn't we, Sue?
We did.
Yeah.
You got your little...
Just to see what Kath has got to say. Yeah, absolutely. That pre-education. Sure. Be prepared, don't be scared. I think that's the approach we need to take. So I'd just like you to think about what you could take away from today, especially if you haven't kind of gone there yet. Yeah, I might hand over to you for that.
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of, and David just shared some amazing, there's a lot of takeaways I think we can take from the Lifeblood journey. But I think, first and foremost, and we've got here educating health and safety practitioners because we're coming at this from this health and safety lens. But really, psychosocial risk and physical risk, I think, where I see it work well, like with Lifeblood, where there's a multidisciplinary approach. So P&C working really closely with WHS, working really closely with legal, ER and operations. So I think it's, identifying in your organisation sort of who needs to have this a bit more education, perhaps starting with those key stakeholders that might work as a multidisciplinary group. I think really clearly, deep diving into your data, the data that you've got already, because you would have quite a lot of data about who works, in your organisation. So deep diving into that, finding out, again, like Lifeblood did, particularly around incident trends. What are some of those other psychosocial risk factors? I think all incident investigations really now need to have that lens of what other psychosocial risk factors are going on. We know there's a really clear interplay between psychosocial risk and musculoskeletal disorders. There's so much research out there on that. So really deep diving into that data and really look at your workplace through that lens of, as Thea mentioned, not just menopause, but other sort of health stages, other, having that lifestyle, life stage lens to your workplace, and focusing again on that health part of health and safety that we often find, as David mentioned, perhaps is the second cousin to safety, but now with the regulations and the obligations is now a little bit more at the forefront. So thanks, everyone. Have you got any other little questions or people starting to head off to have lunch or a cuppa? If you need any more information, education, Thea is absolutely your go-to person for education around menopause. So her contact details are there. If it's around looking at this from a health and safety lens, psychosocial risk assessments and the like, we're very much doing that for a lot of clients at the moment. And if you had some key questions for David and for Lifeblood around their journey and some of the tools that he's mentioned, I've put a link to the Affirm tool in the chat as well. Then there's David's contact details, so take a photo or a screenshot and get in contact with us. Thea, did you want to wrap up?
No, that's all great. So thanks again, David, for really bringing this topic to life. Really grateful for you sharing your experience. And yeah, you've got our contact details there if you want to keep the conversation going.